and welcome. Nice to see you all. This is actually kind of my annual rite of passage. I know summer has arrived when it snows in the middle of June and I speak to the park colloquium. And it's not always the same day, but it's often right in that time. Holly kind of covered my basic introduction. I will kind of use my background to, in both biology and law, to illustrate how water has been allocated in the state of Montana. And the story all starts back in Bannock. Has anybody ever been to Bannock State Park? It's worth a trip if you haven't, if you have time while you're in Montana or if you live here. Go on down because it's a ghost town and it's really the foundational place geographically of both water law and fish management. And water law and fish management depart from Bannock in about 1862 and don't really converge again, take two separate parallel paths, and don't really converge again until the 1960s, almost 100 years later. So I'd like to take you on that route over time and talk about how water was allocated, first with no regard to environmental flows or fisheries, which is my obvious bias, but how, in spite of that allocation of water over time, we've still managed to make change. Because as a fish biologist, one of my frustrations was, starting with my graduate work on the Yellowstone, is there's no water in stream. There's no doubt. I mean, it's not a surprise to any of you that water is a fundamental requirement for a fish. So when I'm standing there on a stream, the Yellowstone, I had 3 tributaries of the Yellowstone that I studied. My job was to figure out how much water they need, but then I was told, well, there's nothing you could really do about it. I mean, you could cajole or beg or work with ranchers, but there was no real incentive for them. And I'll talk about the legal incentives or disincentives for water conservation. But think about, this is Grasshopper Creek as it exists about now. It's a beautiful stream. This is how Grasshopper Creek looked in the 1860s. So obviously the stream had very little regard, or the miners had very little regard for the environment as they were moving forward. And it makes practical sense if you think about it. Montana's a vast wilderness, and they're only digging up a really small portion, right? So it made sense, but the implications of their work as miners in the trenches was they created a custom and a culture that evolved into a law of allocating property rights in water. So I'll talk about those, hit the high points, and again, it wasn't until 1960 that we started thinking about, oh, fish need water, not just in a biological sense, but also in a physical sense, or a legal sense. So let's talk about Montana history. Pre-1800, there wasn't a whole lot of angling going on, fishing in Montana, right? The Salish, Kootenai, and Ponderay people on the west side of the Continental Divide were a fishing culture. And bull trout, especially, a native fish, large fish out of the Flathead Basin, was a sacred animal to them. Both brought them food, like salmon further west. But it was an integral to their culture. The plains cultures on the east side of the Continental Divide were more focused on ungulates, especially bison, and following bison around. So you don't see much by way of fishing on the east side of the divide until Lewis and Clark show up. And one day they send out Private Goodrich, who happened to be kind of the appointed fisherman for the Corps of Discovery. And Silas Goodrich goes out while the rest of the Corps of Discovery are heaving all their supplies around the Great Falls of the Missouri, which is right at, ironically, the town of Great Falls, Montana. They're all lugging stuff across the plain to get above this series of falls where Silas gets to go fishing. And Silas catches half dozen very fine trout. West Slope cutthroat trout, if you're an angler, you'll know that a 16 to 23 inch trout in Montana is a pretty good sized trout. Well, Silas dutifully takes his stringer of fish, walks back to Meriwether, Lewis, and William Clark and says, here's my fish for the day. Nice job, Silas. And they sit down and dutifully describe the fish. They draw pictures and they describe its characteristics. And then they have it cooked and eat it, and they name it after themselves, Salmo Clarkii Lewisi, cutthroat trout. Great day for Silas, great day for science, right? So that's really our first fishing expedition. And fishing shows up several times if you read the journals. And I love this one because on August 15th of 1805, William Clark in his journal reports that he almost got bit by a rattlesnake. He and Sakakawea. They were out just standing there and almost got bit. Well, Private Whitehouse rats him out. And in his journal he says, while Captain Clark was fishing, he almost got bit by a rattlesnake. So even in 1805, angling was a guilty pleasure here in Montana. So I always wonder if there was some sort of repercussions for Whitehouse if he got some horrible latrine duty or something for ratting him out. So again, now here we are at Bannock, Gold Strike 1862, and it was a short time later, in 1865, February 22nd of 1864, 100 years before I was born, the first territorial legislature convenes. And most of you know that 1864 is in the thick of the Civil War in the United States. So what do you think the territorial legislature thinks about? It passed 14 bills or laws in the first territorial legislature. There was a bill about whether or not they should side with the Union or Confederacy here in the territory of Montana, newly minted territory, and they passed the fishing regulation. So here in Bannock, ironically, water law begins its first foundations, and so does fisheries management. And again, they depart. Just as an interesting side note, they had to amend the law in 1876, still well before Montana statehood, to say you couldn't use explosives on the end of your rod and reel, or end of your rod if you were fishing. So 1889 is really foundational in the terms of water law. Because 1889, February 22nd, 1889, 75 years before I was born, Montana became a state. And when it became a state, it came into the Union with the Dakotas all at once under the Enabling Act. Congress passed an act saying Montana is admitted. And the most important thing for this discussion is the Enabling Act brought Montana in on equal footing as all the other colonies. So we didn't have these subservient states in the Union. Everyone was on equal footing. And that was particularly important because it gave the state all the water. Remember, Louisiana Purchase, we bought this huge chunk of ground. Part of it was in Montana at the time, or was what we call Montana now, became property of the federal government. The whole thing, public land, federal government. Well, in the Enabling Act, the federal government hands over the water along with a bunch of public property. It goes from public estate to state land to help states generate income to start schools. But the water rights then all began, all the water was turned over to the state. And just as a side note, this is the same year, the same time that rainbow trout, brown trout, and brook trout were introduced into Yellowstone Park in the headwaters of the Yellowstone and Madison River, two of the most famous trout streams in the United States. So again, the equal footing doctrine, all the water belongs to the people of the state, mostly. So as we became an official member of the Union, Montana passed the Constitution. And at the time, figuring prominently is water. And this is kind of foundational for water law. First, it was turned over to the state. Then the state, through its constitution, said, okay, the use of water is a public use. Now that has special legal meaning because a public use is what's required to condemn private property, right? In the East, if you want to use water out of a river and you own property next to the river, you have reasonable use of that water. You just get to use it. In the West, it doesn't work that way. You could take your water, under the prior appropriation doctrine, you could take your water and you can move it 20 miles if you have the gumption to a place where you can put it to beneficial use. You don't have to be along the stream. You can move it a long distance. And you can move it a long distance across other people's private property. It's a public use. Recognizing that the use of the water in the arid West was very important. It's a scarce resource and we needed to be adaptable. Incidentally, here in Bozeman was the first federal fish hatchery west of South Dakota, and that came online in 1896. So again, you have this parallel, and ironically, that hatchery has some of the most senior water rights on Bridger Creek, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So what we have is we have this 1862 to 1889, 27 years where water was being allocated before Montana was even a state, before Montana even had the authority to allocate water. Well, how did they do it? First in the mining camps. First in time, first in right. Water law is a series of cliches. First in time, first in right. Seniority means the first person to arrive at the stream and put that water to a beneficial use, I mean divert it, and in the mining camps, they use it to sluice or to dissolve rock, to break it up, and then to float the gold out of it. So that was the original beneficial use. If you got there first and you stake your mining claim, you get the first right to use the water. And if you use all the water, that's your right, as long as you're not wasting it. Then the next person in line can come along and use the scraps, and so on and so on and so on. First in time is first in right. It's the prior appropriation doctrine, the riparian doctrine, again back east. If you're next to the river, you get reasonable use of the water. Different schemes. Another one is use it or lose it. So there's a serious incentive based on this prior appropriation scheme. There's a serious incentive to maximize the use of your water, to use as much as you can, as often as you can, to assert your right. So there's built-in conflict in the prior appropriation scheme. If you don't use it, the next person in line, the next junior, and so on and so forth, gets their crack at the water. So right now, while the rivers are running full, everybody's getting use of the water right now. But soon, say you're a Gallatin River water right holder, and you have an 1889 priority date, you're going to get shut off probably by the 15th of July. That's with an 1889 priority date. Because there's 1868 water rights out there that are big, and they get to use all the water first. So again, if the 1868 water user doesn't use their water right, then the next person down the line gets it. So again, the incentive is use it all as much as you can, as long as you can, and if you don't use it, you actually lose that property right. It's all based on beneficial use. 80% of our water in Montana, and actually much of the world, is used in agriculture. So it's the primary use. So as water becomes scarce, and there's other beneficial uses, municipalities or domestic uses, industry, and in-stream flow, if you're vying for a limited supply, where's it going to give? So agriculture feels embattled, which again adds to that conflict. It's built around conflict. If you're senior and somebody's upstream with a shovel and you don't defend your right, you can lose that right. So that's a couple other cliches. The reality is whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. Water's more precious and abundant in the West, or more precious and scarce in the West than whiskey was, right? If you're gonna fight, you do it over water. Conflict, it's all about conflict, defending your right. If it's better to be upstream with a shovel than downstream with a senior right, that's because the senior downstream has got to pick up a shovel or a shotgun or the sheriff and go up to his neighbor's diversion and shut it down. You got to call for water. So you see the inherent conflict. Why it's for fighting? Because if you're junior, you're going to use as much as you can, as long as you can, until somebody shows up with a shotgun or a shovel or a sheriff that tells you to shut down. It's built-in conflict. Doesn't always work with the prior appropriation scheme. All right, so what's the net effect? Let's turn back the clock again to 1806, and let's take a look at Bear Creek. It's a tributary of the Madison River. It comes out of the Lee Metcalf Wilderness and then flows due west until it hits this giant glacial moraine. This whole country, all across here, on your way to Ennis, which would be on the upper left hand or upper right hand part of the screen to you, it goes across this giant prairie created by glaciers, which means there's boulders this big, and sand and gravel and cobble, all across this expanse, which is very thirsty geology. And that water ends up in the Madison River, which runs roughly in this area along the timeline as they travel parallel and then meet at the town of Ennis. Has anybody been up the Madison Valley? Did you stop at the Blue Moon Saloon, which is right here? That's probably the geographic center of the area. So we're going to look at Bear Creek. Here we go, Melissa Clark time, about the time Silas Goodrich was fishing out on the river. There was no allocation. If you look down on the lower right, You see the blue represents the amount of water traveling through Bear Creek as it gathers and bigger as it goes downstream and picks up tributaries. And none of that is allocated. It's all blue. Now you notice the appearance of the arrows. By 1867, 1879, you can see all the diversions that have come into place. And there's this thin orange fraction of the water that's now been allocated. People have laid claim to that water. They've put it to beneficial use. They've dug their ditches. They've defended it against their neighbors. And there's tons of water still out there, right? 1879, okay, we're not even to statehood yet. And here we are, 1881, within a few short years, we've allocated almost all the water at the headwaters and about 2/3 to a half of the water all the way down to Ennis. So if you have a water right pre-1880 in Bear Creek, you're in pretty good shape. But if you have an 1882 water right, all of a sudden you're on the short end of the stick. Just that amount of time makes a huge difference in your ability to use the water. 1909, fully allocated. There's no legal water available left. Diversions from stem to stern all the way down to the Madison. And finally, up to modern by 1971, all the water is allocated and then some. So all the water available in this arid place has been really given away by statehood, and in some cases, maybe not until the 1970s. So we've given all the water away as a people, right? We own the water since 1889, but we've given away the right to use that, and it's a property right. So what do we have left for fish? Well, during irrigation season, especially in a dry year, there's nothing left for fish in tributaries. And so you can see how the incentive to create property rights in water had environmental consequences. And again, this is what I was facing as a graduate student, saying, figure out how much water they need. Well, standing there going, oh, and by the way, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, we found out there is something you can do about it. I thought I'd bring up Federal Reserve rights because, all those rights that are allocated now by 1972 aren't really cataloged. Some counties actually kept exquisite records, just like they did property deeds, recording water rights. Some of them stuffed them in a drawer. Some people never filed on their water right. Just everybody knew, Joe Smith had the biggest water right in Tallman Creek. Everybody knows it, so, he's one tough SOB. So, stay away from Joe's water. But overlaying atop this confusion, this uncertainty about who owns what, except for locally, you have a new layer thrown on. It's called Federal Reserve water rights. So remember, the federal government bought Montana, this area, from Napoleon. And I can't remember the date. It was 1804, 1802, something like that. Napoleon needs some cash to fight a war. So the federal government owned everything, land, water, air, wildlife, and then started allocating it to the states. Well, this is my great-grandfather. He came over from Austria about 1898, and he and his neighbors built the Milk River Irrigation District, one of the biggest irrigation districts in Montana still. And they did it in spite of the Indians, the Brabant and Assiniboine tribes downstream, which had recently been moved onto the reservation through treaty. And then my granddad and his neighbors said, well, they don't get water rights, they're federal. We're states own the water. Well, they were taken they went all the way to the Supreme Court and ended up creating unintended consequence of their intransigence was create the Winters Doctrine. It's actually named after Henry Winter, who was the first plaintiff. The Winters Doctrine, where the Supreme Court said, well, when the federal government gave away or, ceded land to the states and in the water, they still retained an implied reservation of water necessary to fulfill the purposes of a reservation. In this case, the Bellman, thank you. And they kept this reservation, right, for the native people. Well, they can't be left without water, so the Supreme Court reasoned that there is this implied reservation of water. Well, how do you quantify that? Well, over time, the courts did it. through litigation. And it directly conflicted with the prior appropriation scheme, which was pretty straightforward. First in time, first in right. Use it without waste. But then all of a sudden you have overlaying on this confusion already where we didn't really record water rights. You put this federal implied right on top of it, creating more confusion. And the courts narrowed it down and said, okay, it's the minimum amount of water necessary to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. So in Montana, we have 9 Indian reservations, we have wildlife refuges, we have federal lands, federal lands in the form of U.S. Forest Service, and we have BLM lands, we have national parks and national monuments. Each of those has a implied water right. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then in Congress, to try and clear up this confusion, said, okay, the McCarran Amendment waives sovereign immunity of the federal government and says, okay, all these federal reserve water rights are subject to state adjudication. But Montana didn't even have one in 1952. We were still issuing water rights just by use. So again, to jump over the other parallel track, we're going to talk about what's happening in the world. How's the general public, the people who own the government, who own the water, own the state and federal government, are discontent. The Cuyahoga River burned for the 8th time in the 1960s near Cleveland, Ohio. A river should not burn, and people finally woke up to that. This is the Yellowstone River. This is the Yellowstone River, not too far from Billings, Montana, where as far as you can see, almost a mile of riverbank is stabilized with Fords and Chevys and Edsels and all kinds of things, right? So this is what people were looking at and finally awakening as a people, going, what are we doing to our rivers? Even as a kid in Billings, Montana, where I grew up, you go down to the river to try and catch catfish or trout or whatever, and the river smelled like simple green. It literally was not healthy, and people were waking up to that. So in Montana, we started reining in the idea of water rights and ecology or environment together. We started bringing them back together. We rewrote our Constitution in 1972 in Montana. And it's significant. It's considered one of the most progressive constitutions among the United States. And Michigan and Pennsylvania actually adopted much of our Constitution when those states revised their constitutions. In Montana, a clean and healthful environment is a fundamental right. So it stacks right up there with your fundamental right to free speech, free press, free exercise of religion. In Montana, we have a right to privacy. So a clean and healthful environment is your constitutional right in Montana. That's a staggering change from our earlier history, where we were still just allocating natural resources without really concern for the environment. Article 10 is the other place where it's significant and relevant to our discussion. Article 10, Section 3 is all about water. This is a place where Montana, for the first time in statute or in the Constitution, refers to water rights as a property right. We hereby recognize all existing rights. So those rights that predated statehood back to 1862 in Bannock were ratified under the Constitution as a constitutionally protected property right. Cannot be taken without due process, right? That's significant. It repeated the 1889 Constitution, the use of the water as a public use, which gives it an elevated status. And if in conflict with another property right, your private property right in real estate, your neighbor can run his water across to your ranch. All water, this is a public trust area. All water is the property of the state, and it says all water, atmospheric, surface, groundwater, is the property of the state, and it's held in trust for the use of its people. So that means you can float on it for fun or for profit. You can fish on it. You can enjoy the scenery on it. You can use it for commerce. Those are all constitutional uses of the water. And then there's this big and. And it's subject to appropriation for beneficial uses. So this is a clarification saying, yes, these are all property rights. The use of water is a property right, but it's not mutually exclusive to the other uses. So for example, if you want to put your boat on the Yellowstone River and float down and maybe try and catch a fish, that water might actually be allocated, completely spoken for, but the fish still swim in it. People have a right to use it, and you have a right to float on it. So they're not mutually exclusive. And this was an important clarification of the law that I actually, in my one case that I've taken to the Supreme Court, we clarified that part. Finally, the statewide administration of water rights, it was subsection 4 of Article 3. This is the first time, 1972, the Constitution, the people said, okay, you gotta get this straight. We're gonna catalog everybody's water right. We're gonna reach back in time, and everybody's gonna file a claim on their water right. We're gonna put them all together. We're gonna identify who has what, how much, and what their priority is, and we're gonna figure out how to do Federal Reserve water rights, and we're gonna put it all together. I won't go into great depth, but this is the same time where Montana started to protect its river fish habitat in the form of the 310 law on your right and the Stream Protection Act. The first ever laws of their kind in the country that said if you're going to manipulate the bed and banks of a stream for a bridge or a culvert or to move it out of your way, you have to get a permit first from the state. So at the same time, we're really changing our view of the river. And this manifests itself in what I think is one of the most untold but profound acts of the state and the country was Montana, based on some research done by Dick Vincent, who was one of my mentors and managers, found out that stocking fish, the hatchery I mentioned over in Bridger Canyon, that we were trying to stock our way out of habitat problems. Low water, poor water quality, or bulldoze streams and straightened streams. We just stock more and more. And Dick found out that that's not the way the world works. Ecologically, if you put these hatchery fish in, you're actually suppressing the ability of the ecosystem to sustain itself. So Montana just stopped stocking streams in the 1970s that could support themselves. But if you do that, then you have to talk about the water quality problems and the water quantity problems. So this is working hand in hand with the development of the Water Use Act, right? Because if you don't have water, you don't have fish, and you can't just stock your way out of it. Significantly, so this Montana Water Use Act was passed in 1973, the first legislative session after the Constitution. And throughout the act, it has statements like this, that we're all about allocating water and full use of the water with a big but. Assure adequate supplies for public recreation and conservation of fish and wildlife. We're going to maximize our use with the least possible degradation of aquatic resources. So I don't think it's necessarily remorse looking back and going, oh, we gave it all away. It's no, that there's this, we got to strike this balance. How are we going to strike this balance though when we have property rights that were established a century and a half before? The act also came up with some schemes or some ways, tools, I guess you'd call them, to address this imbalance or this early allocation of water. One is establishing in-stream flow reservations. Okay. Take a river like the Yellowstone. Right now it's running about 22,000 CFS. Right now it's allocated to the extent of about 3,500 CFS. So there's actually a lot of unallocated water left. So what the legislature allowed Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to do, our state conservation agency, was to grab part of that surplus and protect it as in-stream flow. But it's a junior water right, remember. It's a 1978 or 82 priority date, pretty low. It's meaningful during runoff, because that means somebody can't just put in a big pipe and take that extra runoff. They can take some, but not all of it. Some of that's for fish. But in the wintertime, think about it. Agricultural rights are 80% of the rights. Agriculture grows crops between April and October. So all of a sudden these junior in-stream flow reservations become senior in the winter. So it's hard to allocate water to the detriment of fisheries in the winter in Montana. The statewide adjudication of water, is a great idea. Everyone files a claim. We'll work through all these, court case by court case. We'll work through the water rights and decide who gets what. 4 years. But we're working on it. It's a long way to go. But the legislature and State Water Use Act also did something. They drew a line, July 1, 1973. If you have a water right before that, we're going to call that an existing constitutionally protected property right in water. And then after July 1st, 1973, you got to get a permit if you want to allocate more water, unless there's an exemption, right? You have to go through an administrative process to create that water right. And then, because they closed basins, the legislature said there's no more water in the upper Missouri, there's no more free water rights, everything's allocated. The only way you can do things, new uses of water, is to change, to take one use, more likely agriculture than other, and turn it into another use, maybe municipal water, or maybe in-stream flow. Through an administrative change process, you can take that property right in water, you can lease it, you can sell it. Finally, the Compact Commission, Montana took another different approach in allocating those Federal Reserve water rights. Rather than litigate with the federal government like they did in Colorado for years, very expensive. Montana looked at that, and we were kind of behind them. Like in 1972, it's like, well, how are we going to afford this litigation against the federal government to try and iron out water rights? They created a Compact Commission that actually sat down and negotiated for each reservation. I think there's 14 compacts, and they just finished up last year, still sitting in front of Congress for ratification on some of them, but finally just negotiated water rights. So there's in-stream flows embedded in some of these compacts. So I talked about a lot of this. I won't go into great depth, but important things I talked about: in-stream flow reservations and closed basins. That was part of the early in the door, recognizing that fish needed water. And that started largely because of Senator Murphy in Butte. Senator Murphy introduced a bill to allow Fish and Game to create water rights in 12 of the best fisheries. And again, these were junior, 1969, but it was a foot in the door. And then after my graduate work in 1990, the legislature finally passed a bill allowing fish, wildlife, and parks to lease property rights in water, and convert them to in-stream flow to protect the fisheries. So it's significant, and the legislature, because everyone is pretty suspicious of this new thing, this sea change in water law. You could take your irrigation right and you can lease it to me. I could keep it in stream, but no one could use it, right? If you keep it in stream and the juniors can't use it, then it kind of throws everything topsy-turvy. So they said, oh, only 10 streams and only for 10 years. And then it worked well. One of the first ranchers who leased the water was an opponent of the bill to start with, but he actually carried the bill subsequently to allow not just Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to lease water for in-stream flow, but allow private entities like Trout Unlimited to lease water. It worked so well. And then finally, the Supreme Court, for once and for all, said, okay, in-stream flow is a beneficial use. You don't have to take it away and make money on it. It is a beneficial use. So all these advances come together as that recognition, right? We're not taking away water rights. We're not taking away any of these constitutionally protected water rights or property rights in water, but we're opening the arena for a market to begin, or a market in water to begin. So again, water leasing was that mechanism. It respects the prior appropriation doctrine. It allows private property owners to lease, sell, or convey, devise their property right to other people. But it doesn't take water rights from water users. They're still susceptible to the elements of the water right, like their priority date, and they're still susceptible to abandonment. Every one of my water leases, I have to go out every month and measure how much water is in stream to prove that I'm using it for in-stream flow. Okay? So initially it was just FWP, and then subsequently private entities like Trout Unlimited were allowed to lease water for up to 10 years at a time. We currently have 32 water leases around Montana. There's about 109 total. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks holds about a third, and some of our colleagues on the west side of the divide, Clark Fork Coalition, holds about a third of the water leases. So over 100 water leases out there just for fisheries alone. And just recently, well, not recently, almost 10 years ago, FWP was allowed to hold water rights in perpetuity, but only 10 streams to start with. Well, hopefully we'll be able to lift that sunset. I just accepted a donation of a water right, the most senior water right in Bear Creek, which is right at the boundary of Yellowstone Park. If you stand at the old mine you're looking out into Mammoth Hot Springs. And I just accepted a donation of the most senior year-round water right in Bear Creek, which will convey to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in perpetuity. And thanks to the work of my colleague Laura Zemer here in town, the mining company will receive a tax deduction based on its appraised market value. So, in effect, Montana has, or through our in-stream flow work, Montana has actually created a water market and it's actually established in-stream flow as the major player in the water market. We're actually created the water market rather than waiting for a water market to develop and then trying and vie for water. The Forest Service Compact is an example of one of the Federal Reserve Compacts. Actually has built in some senior and some very junior in-stream flow rights. Again, acknowledging that if the Forest Service has an in-stream flow right that they can protect in the headwaters, if it's in-stream flow, then where does it go? Well, it flows in-stream down to where other water users can take advantage of it. So it's not detrimental, but it does protect a lot of our headwater native trout fisheries. So this is all very heavily water policy, but I want to bring fish back into the fish now. So how are we going to take this ecological concept of fisheries management and how are we going to fit it into the prior appropriation scheme? Well, I'd just like to give you a quick example, and I won't belabor this for you, I don't want to bore you to tears, but if you think about the fundamental principle of ecology is limiting factors. And you've probably all seen a bucket or a pail, a metal pail shot full of holes. It's just a natural target. And if you go to fill that bucket that's been shot full of holes, how much water will it hold? Well, it'll only hold as much as the lowest hole in the bucket. That's how to think of limiting factors. In some streams, the lowest bucket in the hole in the bucket is in-stream flow. Without water, you can't have fish. In some places, it's winter severity, like the Gallatin Canyon, which has tons of water year-round, but it's a very closed and cold place, so there's icing as the limiting factor. So if you add more water, it doesn't really affect, right? So not every stream is limited by the amount of water in the summertime. That's the concept of limiting factors. So this is Yellowstone cutthroat trout, native to the Yellowstone River. The Yellowstone River runs out of Yellowstone Park right at Gardner, travels north and then west up to Fort Union, where the Missouri and the Yellowstone come together just inside the North Dakota border. Yellowstone cutthroat trout occupy the first about 120 miles to just downstream of Livingston Springdale. And for eons, literally, up to 150,000 years, depending on how the glaciations work, Yellowstone cutthroat trout use the tributaries to spawn. But during development, some with water rights dating to 1866, the tributaries were tapped in. It was hard to move water out of this giant river out to your fields, but it was a lot easier to use the tributaries. So most of these tributaries were dewatered. And what happens if you're a fish, especially a cutthroat trout, who goes up to spawn, they're actually spawning right now. They go up and the female does all the work, which doesn't surprise some of you, I'm sure. They fan the gravel and clean it up and loosen it up, and then they deposit their eggs, and then they cover up the eggs in gravel. It's called a red. And these are reds. You see my orange rocks marked reds, or nests. And they're kind of an engineering genius. The way they're built is this tail spill, this back end of clean gravel is where the eggs live. The water, because it's sloped, the water rides up and then goes through the gravel and moves past the eggs to keep the eggs alive. Well, if there's no water, the eggs don't stay alive. They choke off, and without the eggs surviving until about mid-August, then the fry can't swim out of the gravel, right? And you don't have the life cycle continue, right? The population starts to decline. Well, this is the first application of water leasing in Montana was on the Yellowstone, and initially there was water leases on 5 streams. The bottom, the Mill Creek has been a challenge. It's for a variety of reasons, a very complicated water rights situation. It's been litigated and decreed many, many years. It's very difficult to get a water lease to work unless the irrigators are all on board, and in Mill Creek they were not. Certain aspects worked. A flush for 3 days, people shut down and so we could flush the young fry out before the rivers or the streams dried out. But these other ones have been wildly successful, except for Lock Creek. It's been wildly successful in the sense that the water's been there. I mean, the ranchers were very helpful. They got a good irrigation system, and now there's plenty of water. The problem is that limiting factor isn't water in Lock Creek anymore. The Yellowstone River is warming, and whereas cold water fish used to survive all the way down to Billings and Laurel, now cold water fish have a tough time surviving much upstream of Big Timber. And Lock Creek is a kind of a canary in the coal mine, where it's showing that it's turning into a prairie stream. Trout are giving way to native prairie fishes. So this one was a limiting factor issue. So let's just talk about Big Creek real quick. Big Creek is, so I started, that was one of my graduate studies. And so I went out there and I trapped the whole stream. I had a trap, and through high water I captured all the spawners I could capture. I got 5 total spawners surviving in Big Creek. It had been dry for 50 years in the lower, roughly 1 mile of the stream due to irrigation withdrawals. But Bruce Malcolm, who was, old school rancher, great guy, smart as a whip, said, I'm willing to work with you. And Fish and Game, they put in a pipeline. So imagine this ditch as wide as this aisle, running brim full of water in this glacial till. Remember, like I described in the map, some big rock and sand and silt doesn't hold water, it all just goes underground. He said, yeah, I mean, really what I want is, I need to go to sprinklers. At that time, Bruce was getting on in years, and he said, sure, you put in a pipeline and a bunch of sprinklers and make my life easier, you can have all the rest of the water. And it was wildly successful. So just to demonstrate that, I go back every year now, off and on, in different capacities, and I've done red count, so it's not a continuous chain of event, but you can see that we went from about 27 reds, basically 5 fish doing all that work, to 135 last year. It all go out first week of August or first week of July this year and count them again. But we've gone from almost 0 fry production. So I know it's 0 because I had a fry trap, and the last trickles as they diminished in Big Creek, and I never got a fry, a young cutthroat trout fry. And now, in 2005, we had 18,000 fry. Last couple of years, we're modeling it says about 40,000 fry. So that's significant, right? Because 40,000 baby fish are born, and about 10% of those survive their first year. That's just the way fish work. They feed all kinds of things. So we get about 40,000, that's that 4,000 fish survive through their first year. And then up till spawning age, basically 3 years old, 10% will survive. So 400 fish come back. So you see how rapidly trout can respawn when they have good habitat. That's the magic of in-stream flow. Now, I took out one slide because it was pretty detailed. But now, the Yellowstone cutthroat trout population is about 1/3 of the salmonid community in the Yellowstone River. It used to be about 2%. So we've restored a native species just by 5 leases, and now I've got 4 or 5 coming up that are online. So we'll be able to secure a long-term future for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, not by fighting the water market, but by creating a water market. And this information, it really didn't, I've said this for many years, but it dawned on me finally this year, having gone through this donation process. We had to do a really good job of documenting the market value of the water rights through an appraisal process. If you look into appraising water rights, you'll see as early as 2006, one of the major authorities on appraising water rights was saying there is no in-stream flow can't be a highest and best use. It's not even really a beneficial use. To the 2016 version that finally said, oh yeah, I guess there is value in water. And what we found was the value of water was the highest and best use. Our appraiser, who's a great, good mind, and she does a lot of work in Nevada, California, and Montana, she looked at it and she said, municipal water, they're adequate. They've got reservations, they've got all kinds of water. So that market's gone. Industry doesn't really tap into water until you get all the way to Billings. The market for water in Montana is in-stream flow for fisheries. And there's quite a bit of value. There was a transaction, see a 2011 transaction that was worth about $4,000 or about $4,000 per acre foot. So anyway, this long and tortured path that we took, we separated fish from water, and then starting in the 1960s, we started to bring them back together. What we see is an emerging water market based on in-stream flow. So we got out ahead of it. Means we're a full participant as fish conservation people. We don't have to take away people's water. We don't have to. There's always a bill in the legislature to take the top 20% of the water and put it back in stream. Well, that's constitutionally, it's illegal. I mean, it's a taking. You can't take private property rights without just compensation and due process. It ain't gonna happen. So instead of standing by the river as a graduate student going, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Actually, we can. What we found is you can change the law, work within the prior appropriation scheme, and you can actually create a market for water. Does it pay its own freight? Yes, it pays its own freight. These were old studies in 1995 that identified the economic contribution to the local economies by just the trout fishing alone, not recreation, just trout fishing. 15 million on the Yellowstone River. Last year there was a big fish kill because of really low water due to drought. And the economists out of University of Montana took a look at this, and they came up with a value of $216 million in that trout fishery. And the effect of closing that fishery because of a fish kill due to low water and a disease that had moved in was $55 million effect on the community. It shut down hotels, it shut down restaurants, it shut down fishing guides, obviously. All those ancillary industries associated with the health of the river had a huge economic impact. So not only, for years we've been saying, or we've been told, there's no value in in-stream flow, it's a waste. But we find out now that it actually pays its own freight. In-stream flow recreates fisheries, and good fisheries create economic activity.